Oh, thank you, Kat. Yeah, I know, like, so people can come in.
Be here for sure. Yes. Okay. Cool. All right. Yeah. Can we start? Yeah. Should we start? Yeah. Hi, everybody. Nice. So this is our third presentation. And I am super excited because I feel like we haven't really talked about the Borderlands, even though we are in the Borderlands currently, right? We've had a lot of really local artists like Ryan Rocks, kind of, share Las Cruces, storytelling and stuff. So I am very honored to be introducing Dr. Julia Smith, whose presentation is called Outlaws, Apaches, and Brujas. Oh my, revisionist archetypes of the Old West in The Devil Mistress. So a little bit about Julia really quickly. Julia is a visiting professor at New Mexico State University in English and Gender and Sexuality Studies. She received her PhD from Purdue University in Critical Theory and Cultural Studies with an emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality studies. Julia is currently working on a documentary film titled Birth of the Acid Western, which explores the artistic output of Las Cruces filmmaker and NMSU professor Orville Wanzer. So a little bit about the presentation, right? Just so we kind of have a premise of what we're going to be discussing. So researching her own documentary about the film genre, Las Cruces and Wanzer, Smith reads the film as a revisionist anti-Western that subverts traditional Western narratives. The film's four robbers encounter the devil and his mistress in an isolated cabin. Is it the cabin in the... Yes. Okay, nice.
Baylor.
Yes, yeah. So those of you that have kind of hiked up there, y'all kind of know what we're kind of talking about. But after committing heinous acts, they face retribution through the mistress' occult schemes and sexual manipulation, restoring the devil's domain in a tale of sexual sadism, colonial racism, and perverse reimagining of white masculinity. So without further ado, Dr. Julia Smith.
Thank you so much, Dave. You're awesome. I have a lot to talk about to get to where I want to go. So I've loaded this presentation with images. I can easily go down a wormhole, so Dave's going to keep me on track. And if I don't cover something that you're interested in, I'm going to make sure there's time for questions at the end. I'd also like to just give a huge shout out to Kat and Laura for putting this together. Thank you so much for supporting me and for being incredible. Thank you for making this incredible graphic that I'm going to keep using. And also, I just wanted to talk about a content warning. This is a rape revenge film. And so I will be talking about depictions of rape and sexual violence. All right, let's get into it. All right. Oh, clicked it too many times. All right. Okay, so we already kind of talked about the plot, but I'll keep going deeper into it. The Devil's Mistress is made in 1965 by a film professor named Orville Wanzer. He came here in 1959 to teach English, and he was a cinephile, and he talked about movies all the time, and a friend who stars in The Devil's Mistress asked him if he was so good and loved movies so much, then why didn't he just make one? So this started this process of making a film. I'd also like to shout out to Teddy Gregory, who is one of the original members of WGW Productions, the first local production company in Las Cruces for the first feature film ever made in Las Cruces. Potentially the first independent film ever made outside of Hollywood to a Hollywood premiere. I don't know the research on that. I need to go deeper. I've been searching, but it's hard. Okay, Wanzer really, I think this is an important point before I move in as well, is that like Wanzer's version of filmmaking here was an anti-Hollywood version. It was supposed to be all local filmmaking, all local cast and crew to make films big enough to make another one. It wasn't supposed to be for profit. It was supposed to be making movies that grew out of this area for the purpose of art and personal expression. And that dramatic difference, I think that is coming up today in Las Cruces film industry, bringing in Hollywood, bringing in big budget versus making films that spawn from the area, made by people for artistic expression. So I think that this conversation is very relevant for NMSU and Las Cruces as we think about Wanzer's anti-Hollywood, failed anti-Hollywood revolution, as they often tend to not be exactly what you wanted them to be, but I believe that it still resonates today, and history is sticky. It does not go away. So here it is, and here I am uncovering more and more of this Wanzer tale. There's two Wanzer archives. The first one's at Branson Library. Shout out to Dennis Daly, the head archivist of the Rio Grande Historical Collections, who turned me on to this strange archive. You can see here, these are like reels from the 60s and 70s. They're rusted. And they were just sitting there unhoused. What I mean by unhoused is they're not in archival storage containers. Didn't really have a clear sense of what they contained. They're deteriorating. And they haven't been cataloged into the archive. They've just kind of been brought in. The second archive is the Institute of Historical Survey Foundation. I'll talk about that in a second, depending on which slide is next. Just a little bit about Orville Wanzer. He created the first film studies program here in English in the early 60s. And he also started the first film school at NMSU in the journalism department when it opened in 1966. Off the heels of the Devil's Mistress success, no one else knew how to operate film cameras at the time. And there's also, I would say not hundreds, this is an old slide, maybe like a little over 100 films, Wanzer films, student films, KRWG films in the Orville Wanzer archives at RGHC here. So what I found in the archives was a lot of different labeled film reels, some papers, like this original 35mm trailer has some text of like the script for the trailers. There was a short one and a long one, which we're hoping to digitize maybe. And this is the Institute of Historical Survey, a much different archive, who have the ability to digitize films with this kind of old machine here called the retro scan. I kind of became like a film preservationist, archivist, and local film history sort of documentarian as well in this process. Evan Davies, who is the president of this, died earlier this year. But you can see here, I'm learning how to like splice, learning how to clean the rust off these films. There's me having fun in the archive last summer. I brought in a film archivist as well to help me last summer. And you can see how I've like rehoused these, taking these films to IHSF back to RGHC to get a digital scan of them and like cleaning them as I can in the process. That was last summer, and you can see all the empty cans there that I was stacking. So one of the things that really spawned this project for me academically, or as like a film scholar, was that I saw Orville Wanzer's film as a sort of precursor to a subgenre called the acid western. The acid western is a subgenre of the revisionist western. Let me actually see if that slide is. I'll actually start here and maybe go back. So the revisionist Western is a type of Western that revises conventions of the traditional Western. So in the traditional Western, you all probably know, you have the hero who would be considered often like the cowboy or the sheriff who's going out into the West to tame the land, to bring civilization, right? And there's this antagonisms that's set up between the white men and the indigenous communities. And then in the 60s and 70s, Mexican as the antagonist became much more popular as people started paying more attention to the plight of indigenous peoples at the expense of Mexican immigrants. So there's also this dramatic tension with women in traditional Westerns, where you also see these kind of stereotypes of the dark woman who could be either white or native, or the woman who you don't take home to marry, right? Versus the one who stays in town, not the one who's at the brothel, right? So there's these kind of like limited representations of white women and non-white women in Westerns. What I would kind of broadly say the revisionist Western does is it becomes psychological or existential, where the characters are not so good. There's not such clear-cut lines of who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. There's also a change in style. And I would qualify that as much more like open, big landscapes where humans are sort of shrunk in comparison to the landscape. They're almost overwhelmed by the emptiness and vastness of the landscape. There's a sense of a lack of forward motion, a lack of ability to discern what's right and wrong, who's good and who's bad. And there's also these questions of like, is this character good? You know, and we really see this figure of the outlaw kind of emerge, like the Clint Eastwood man with no name type of, which emerges in the 60s and then much more in the 70s. So I see Wanzer's film as like a precursor to that. Briefly, I'll just talk about acid westerns really quickly. Notably, Hang 'em High, which was directed here in 1968, starring Clint Eastwood, is considered an acid western. Wanzer was somebody who helped on that film. Teddy Gregory also was an extra in that film and helped with the horse wrangling for that. And the first one is noted as Monty Hellman's The Shooting, starring Jack Nicholson. But I see Wanzer's as coming before that. And what I see this film doing is breaking with conventions of earlier Westerns and subverting them. So we have these undermining of like straightforward good versus evil, white versus native, or Mexican, establishing law and order in an uncivilized land is now, what do we do on this land? There's not a sense of forward motion. There's a sense of paralysis. What have we done here? This emerges out of the counterculture. This is a cinema that is born out of the counterculture. And you might think of it broadly as a kind of hallucinogenic expressions of time and space. It doesn't mean it's necessarily like trippy, surreal necessarily, but there's an element of realism where time and space are bent and not clear. So I'll just briefly kind of talk about the scholarship that is around the acid western. The first comes from a very famous New Yorker film critic, Pauline Kael, who's responding to El Topo, which is often considered the first acid western. I could go into a whole wormhole on this, but I'm not going to. But she has her writing on it is really incredible, actually. She's kind of critical of the acid western, saying like, this is popular because these burnout counterculture people, they really think that this is profound, but it's really just kind of like a degraded, commercialized surrealism. It's just kind of taking from true surrealism from the silent era or the French filmmaking, and kind of popularizing it. El Topo was brought in by Yoko Ono and John Lennon. They really spearheaded bringing this film in. Rosenbaum talks about a 1990s film called Dead Man by a director named Jim Jarmusch, starring Johnny Depp. And he's really seeing the acid Western and kind of defining it as a crazed version of auto-destructive white America at its most solipsistic, hankering after its lost origins. Okay, how much time do I have? 3 minutes? 30, okay. I was like, oh God, that's not gonna work. That's not. I have time blindness. I have ADHD. Okay. So what do I see as acid Western themes in The Devil's Mistress? Well, first of all, the film stars 4 somewhat anti-heroes who are outlaws and outsiders. They're escaping society. They've clearly done something bad. They've murdered someone, they've robbed someone. They're probably trying to get to the Mexican border, and they're talking about what they're gonna do. And we hear about the perverse fantasies right away of these cowboys. They're these outlaws, I guess is the term, except for Teddy Gregory's character. Well, 2 of them are kind of nicer, and then 2 of them are kind of worse, but they're all in a group. There's a lot of micro politics to talk about in the film. They're talking about sexual assault right away. They're talking about rape. One of the characters draws this figure and talks about how it's more enjoyable when they struggle, particularly against Native women. And they're also expressing fears about the Apaches. And they're out in the Oregon Mountains. The other thing that happens in this film is there's a turn. So there's a supernatural turn, and there's a play with archetypes. Wanzer is very interested in questions of God throughout his work, which I'll talk about a little later. But these 4 cowboys come upon a cabin. I don't know if I have a photo of it. Maybe not. They come upon a cabin where they meet a woman and a man who are husband and wife, seemingly, and they offer them food. And they start gorging themselves in a very campy sort of scene of excess. And it is quite grotesque. Deliberately, you can see the eating. There's like close-ups of their faces for like 5 minutes. It's incredibly disturbing. And so one of the guys is like, how do they have this food? Where do they get this food? What's going on? They get suspicious. The devil denies their accusations, but also doesn't give them information. They end up murdering him and raping Leah, who is a mute, and they kidnap her. And the film changes dramatically after that, where Leah then kills all of these cowboys off one by one, and in the end reunites with the devil. I'll give more details if I need to on that, and you're welcome to ask more. I see Wanzer as putting this film on top of a real history of the Old West and Las Cruces. The Old West in Mesilla, and I'm kind of broadly talking about the 1850s to 1870s when reservations were beginning to be set up in this area for the native populace. But the Apache really never stopped defending the territory. And it really wasn't until the 50s when, so you can see on this map, this is the disputed territory. I cut off the year, I think this is around 1852. So we have New Mexico, but then Mexico is on the other side of the Rio Grande. And so there's Mexican control, there's American control coming down. And then from the east, Apache territory. So it's kind of like at this point, Mexican and US are waging war against the Apaches, who had been violently and successfully resisting. There's really interesting stories of how much suffering the US troops endured for decades out here. Okay, so in the documentary, I see myself exploring and doing a close reading of this film through archetypes. So the first one I'll talk about is this figure of the outlaw, in addition to historicizing this area from the vantage of the indigenous population. And I hope to interview some indigenous scholars for this. So the outlaw is certainly a revisionist Western archetype where the outlaw becomes the central character. We often see them as alienated, disillusioned, repressed, or oppressed, at odds with the dominant social order. And so we see that in across these films. So it's a revision of like white masculinity. And it's certainly like a revision of a political landscape that can no longer be sustained in the 1960s in the conventional or traditional Western genre. I'm also really interested in this figure of the Bruja in The Devil's Mistress, which was the original title of Wanzer's script. Hollywood decided to change it to The Devil's Mistress. Athaliah, which is a Old Testament biblical name, she is a kind of, I see her as a kind of hybrid figure. There's a really interesting word choice in one of the trailers. I spent like an hour trying to find a photo of it this morning, but I couldn't. It's somewhere. But she's described as half caste. And there's different interpretations of, is she white? Is she non-white? She's certainly depicted outside of a normative framework of femininity in the Western. And she has this kind of monstrosity, this supernatural quality. But something about her costume makes me think of Spanish settlers. And so it also makes me think about how Leah sort of becomes this like hybrid figure in the film. There's like a sense that she's white because the color of her skin and her facial features, but of course in the 60s, anyone who wasn't blonde and obviously white could be kind of perceived as not quite that. So there's a lot of different sort of interpretations of what is her race, but I certainly see her rape as connected with this perverse fantasy at the beginning of the film, where instead of raping outright an indigenous woman, where indigenous people never show up in this film, they're actually this kind of glaring absence, which I think is also very productive to think about, not just what's there, but what's not there. But so there's this kind of continuum of sexual violence as a form of domination and a form of taking ownership of what belongs to other men, potentially, right? So there's a sort of trafficking or an ideology of the traffic of women where if they rape and kidnap the women of the enemy, that is a kind of perverse rule of settler colonialism, where there's always the need to go to an extreme to prove some point where it becomes perverse. It's not just about eradication, it's also about humiliation. It's also about violation and degradation and a dehumanization that often takes place in settler colonialism through violent acts, sexually violent acts. I also wanted to bring up, and this is something I want to explore deeper in the documentary and maybe potentially also speak to a scholar on this, is this casta system that comes out of old Mexico and the Old West when there are these kind of mixings of different races and cultures, and there becomes this kind of like hierarchicalization and taxonomization. But you notice that there's that a woman is always the figure, right, who kind of mediates that mixing. Okay. The other key thing that I think makes this documentary interesting, and this is kind of what have been struggling with, I guess, since it started and I went deeper into the film, is finding out this sort of meta-contextual information about Wanzer, not only his life, but his other works. In particular, his letters that he writes at the end of his life that reveal that he was quietly bisexual, and that he also experimented with becoming a woman later in his life, not through chemical means or surgical means, but he was using like supplements to like increase his estrogen. And he was really interested in gender and like in a really interesting way. It's not a conventional way because he wouldn't have really considered himself queer or called himself gay or really thought of himself as some kind of identity because of his sexual, according to friends that knew him at this time. But he talks about, there's a really interesting section in his letters where he talks about one, like noticing the changes, noticing how his body feels, noticing how his psychology is shifting. But he's also thinking about like what this means in terms of like seeing from two sides. And he talks a lot about Tiresias, who's a figure from ancient Greek mythology, who was the blind prophet. And for a while, Tiresias lived as a woman and then a man. So Tiresias, part of his prophetic vision was his capacity to see from both the side of a male and a female. Wanzer talks a lot about gender. He talks a lot about the nature of God, the nature of humanity. And he was a very kind of sensitive person, but he was also someone who struggled to talk about his feelings, even though he was somehow always talking about feelings. And I think one of the things I'm thinking through with this documentary, getting to digital storytelling, is how I navigate my relationship to this story within the film. There's a couple of things that make me think of that. One is that I somehow seem like the best person in the world to have found this article based, or this archive based on my research and my interests. And just knowing immediately the uniqueness of it, and like, I found a fucking gold mine here, and no one seems to know, except maybe Dennis Daly and a couple other archivists and the people who worked on the film and knew Wanzer. As a queer artist and a queer filmmaker, that then makes me think of his films differently. And I read his films differently. I read them queerly, which is to say that I'm thinking through his art in terms of how he's undermining binaries, how his art is pushing against normative values, how his art is attempting to locate him outside of normative culture, but also draw people into these other worlds that he's creating. I also don't want this to be a hagiography. I'm not trying to paint a portrait of Orville Wanzer as a saint. I also want there to be this kind of conflict that I feel around a lot of things that I've found out or think about in terms of his art, in particular that he was sleeping with his students. And just getting out of grad school, I certainly had a lot of experience with professors sexualizing me. So in some ways, like, I felt there was like this affinity with Wanzer in terms of his filmmaking, his point of view, but also imagining myself as his student. Also put me in this position where I was like, I feel like I need to be critical of this person. So I've been working through that for quite a while. And I think that kind of maybe leads me to this clip that I put together for you all today. It's not the clip that I meant to put together, but I think what it's doing is I'm trying to find my voice as a filmmaker in this story and think about where I belong in the film. I initially didn't, I wanted it to be kind of like a fly on the wall, direct cinema style, but now I'm like, maybe it's a more Herzog kind of thing, not to just talk about male filmmakers. But you know, there's a way in which I think I need to have a voiceover. And so I think this clip is like me thinking through that voiceover, thinking about how I'm going to connect myself within this story to make sense of it. Because another thing that came out of responses to my work here is like, well, why would you, a feminist professor, be interested in this like seemingly triggering, offensive, no longer would be acceptable kind of storytelling? But for me, I've always been interested in bad film, cinema that doesn't belong, outsider work, even if it's not politically perfect or correct. I think those are the types of stories that certain people like me. That's the work I do. Other people do other work, but I look at the stuff that's hard to talk about. I've always been interested in taboo. The things that we're not allowed to talk about, I feel like, are the things we should be talking about in public spaces. My grad student Hamed might be able to attest from being in my class last semester, who also did a project on Wanzer and brought it to the Brannigan Cultural Center. So it's been very exciting that, you know, the Wanzer story is opening and it's blossoming, and I'm hoping to finish the film. Anyway, I'm happy to talk more, but I want to make sure I'm not going over time, and I want to hear anyone's thoughts. So we'll stream this little video. I'm very embarrassed, but I'll be interested to hear all of your thoughts. Thank you. Okay, well, since there's still a second, I can keep talking. There's certainly a sense in which the reason I chose this passage that you're going to hear for the voiceover is Wanzer. You get a sense of Wanzer's worldview, how he thinks and talks. And there's a particular line here where he says, you know, we have chaos and cosmos, and we have these kinds of competing ideologies from science and the humanities. And what he really says is, like, there is no one or the other. You cannot separate these two things. He says the best we have is cause-os, like a combination of these two things, and they're inextricable. And I think he's working through, and I see that as a queerness also in his work as an artist. So, and the exposition you'll see is some of the student films and some of Wanzer's films that are beyond just The Devil's Mistress, but also a little bit of his second full feature film. I'll take questions in just a second, Gerald. 3 minutes.
Each pain is an equation of my life. The burning is hunger. The swelling is love. And the cleavage, the splitting, the rupture, that's God. God, the final searing purge, the rendering that opens me to the bowels and lets the demon free.
Orville Wanzer's Letters to Peter Goodman, January 12, 1988. Did you know that if all the people and all the living matter and all the stars, planets, comets, all visible things disappeared in an instant, the universe would still be largely intact? It seems that all things that can be seen, all things having physical reality to our senses, represent but 1% of the material in the universe, the rest being the ever-present and universal dark matter, the stuff in between. The theoretical scientists now thinking that all matter and energy is composed of strings of subatomic stuff that vibrate within a constant bath of energy waves. Sometimes, in the depths of the night, amidst and between the barking of my dogs, the howling and yapping of the coyotes, and the wind in the creosote bushes, sometimes I too hear that celestial music, enchanted for the moment, carried away to some deep, deep inner space just before I fall asleep in my chair. It all sounds so lovely, and at the same time so dippy. Our logic systems have to fail, in that we insist on positing opposing entities, male and female, hot and cold, chaos and cosmos, when in truth, all that is and all that can ever be is kamos, which certainly sounds much better than cause-os. I could almost become religious if I thought God was a sublime musician plucking the strings of being. But sadly, I still have no room for God, and he would be better off looking for adoration in a more distant land. There is no God in Bend in the River, only me. Later.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. I think so I am not necessarily a film kind of like geek, right? But watching this film and not understanding the like the filmmaker's like identity and perspective and understanding, I was like, what am I watching? Like it is truly like even like the eating part and stuff like that, like it is grotesque and like you feel it as a viewer, right? So I'm glad that you spoke about that, and I know that there's a lot of questions, but yeah, I just like y'all should see it if you haven't seen it. It is like streaming.
Yeah, recently available to stream for free on Tubi. It's a quick
Yes.
one. It's like an hour long,
It
so
is an
check it
hour
out.
long. I'm all an hour and 5 minutes long to be precise. But yeah, y'all, so please go see it. I know that there's a lot of questions and I want to give space for that, right? So I know, sir, you had the first one. So if you want to ask.
It was by chance encounter that I met Dr. Smith about a week ago, and she mentioned she was going to be briefing on this. So that's why I'm here. And that's why I was tipped off to watch the movie beforehand. And I loved the movie. I thought it was fantastic. I thought, and I don't have quite the right descriptive words, but the tension in the movie, it was excellent. And I personally gave, and it's not my genre of movie. That is not a movie that I like because it was too much tension, worrying about how it was going to go. But I gave it 5 stars. Now here's my question. I watched it on Prime, big screen.
It's on Prime? I didn't know.
Yes. Do you know how many stars they gave it?
1.
1. And that is my question. And before I let go of this microphone, you're omitting one group of characters in the movie that should be given praise to. And this is not funny, it is intentional. The horses. The horses.
He can speak to that. He was the horse wrangler for the film.
Okay, no, the horses were great. I love that opening scene, especially when they're climbing up and one stumbles. And I've climbed over and it's interesting, they strung this out as, this is 4 days to cross the mountain range. I've climbed the Oregon Needle many times, and I've run races over the top of it, in less than an hour. But it's really just an excellent movie. I certainly recommend for anyone who wants to watch a Western with tension and you're worrying about it all.
That's the part that I didn't include today, was just the making of this film, which I've gotten a lot of background from Teddy. Just the heroic effort of it is in itself commendable. The amount of work and time and effort to do something no one had ever done before and never even thought of in this area in particular. Would you like to say something, Teddy? Well, okay, I'll field that. I'll let Teddy, and then I'll field that, yeah.
What was the question?
I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about the horse wrangling or the making of the film, or.
Oh, making of The Devil's Mistress is one of the greatest experiences of my life. Believe it or not, for 12 months of my life, I was actually 20 years old. Think about that.
I almost put a picture of you because, yeah, you're so young and dashing.
But going through in 1965, the next film made in New Mexico was in 68, I think. And then Hang 'em High came after that. But back in those days, we had to do everything. There was no digitation of anything. In the movies, when you hear a coyote howling, that was me. When you hear the wind blowing at a campfire, that was me. So when we got in the studio, and was lip syncing everything. We didn't have sound effects, canned, I mean. So we had to do everything, and it was a great experience. Matter of fact, the photography, I shot, I was the cinema photography for that movie also. So all of the scenes, when Buddy would say, I need 3 grackles in a tree, I would go out and wait till 3 grackles were in a tree, and I would film them. The rattlesnake scene where the cowboy climbs up and he is bitten, that was me. I found a rattlesnake. I lay down in front of the rattlesnake. They say they can only strike the distance of their body. I have no idea if that's true. So on a Bolex, your hand is in the front to push the on button.
16mm camera.
So I lay down in front of the snake and let him strike into the camera. So all of the photography was my work. So.
Wow.
I'll just say
Wow.
something really quickly about your question, Gerald, and I think this is a question about the nature of mainstream cinema. You know, that like I'm sure you can, if those of you have seen it, it's not an entertainment film necessarily. It's striving to be something like that, but it's also, I would say, more in the realm of European art cinema, even as that's an argument that I'm kind of making for a more scholarly article. I tried to get an NEH around it, but I didn't get it. But I was thinking about, you know, how European art cinema is a huge influence for Wanzer, but then there's exploitation cinema in the United States, like the B movies, the drive-in films. Wanzer knew he could exploit, you know, these kinds of cultural anxieties, you know, sexual violence, the degradation of good and evil. Those questions aren't always fun to explore for an entertainment thing, right? And it can make people uncomfortable. And I think that Wanzer was a provocateur in that way. Like I would really consider him a kind of iconoclastic artist. And so it is something that like you're either kind of into because you like this kind of intellectually or thematically, or you're interested in like regional filmmakers or Westerns, but like for the mainstream audience, it would be, why am I watching this? Especially because of the quality. That's a hard thing for people to handle. So I'm hoping we can find a way to like remaster maybe a 4K version, and in some universe, maybe that's possible. The photography, yeah.
And I love the four-day walk through the Organ Mountains. You know, I mean, it was so funny because, you know, I've walked through that, you know, so, but I mean, really, really well done. It's a movie to really watch and be impressed. Yeah.
Check it out.
Is there any other like, okay, cool. Because I have a lot of them, but I don't want to take up too much time.
Craig has been a longtime supporter of my work on this film since late 2018, early 2019.
It's a request. Not really a question, it's a request, but I've been watching you do this from the beginning. And one of the great aspects of this documentary to me as a fiction writer is that you briefly knew your subject.
Yes.
Could you tell that story really
Yeah.
quickly? It's touching.
Yeah, I found this film in late 2018, kind of followed up early 2019, watched the film, found out Wanzer was still alive. People thought he was dead, actually. No one kind of knew where he was. They thought he was dead. Then all of a sudden, found Wanzer. Evan Davies of IHSF found him and took me to Memorial Hospital as a surprise. I didn't know that we were going to go up into this man's hospital bed, which made me incredibly uncomfortable. But I immediately turned on my iPhone and started asking him questions. He couldn't hear, so I was like writing these questions down. and very quickly got together a crew of CMI students, Creative Media Institute students, to start filming interviews. I got 4 recorded interviews with him before he died. It was like within a month that I'd watched the film and he died. And I found, so it was like very quickly, and it felt very like fate, like, oh, okay, like there's definitely some reason this was thrown into my lap. And now I have this life celebration where everyone's coming from across the globe, and I have this crew of students interviewing every single person at the, so I got like tons of interviews right away, collecting tons of information. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Craig.
It's crazy that that was like the beginning of the journey, and like,
Yeah.
but I'm glad that he kind of knew what you were going to move into, right? Is there any other questions? Thank you so much. That was really insightful.
Hi there.
Hello.
Since we were talking a bit about the reception to the film, at least on Prime, I wondered how the film was received when it was completed in 1965, was it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. That was another really exciting thing, was Dennis gave me like all of these PDFs of press releases from around New Mexico. Like there was even Taos News, Albuquerque Journal, Roswell, Alamogordo, and lots of stuff from Cruces, obviously. And it was mixed. Like some people really praised it and some people were like, I don't know, this is kind of missing the mark for me. And I didn't really love it, like, I don't know. Like, so I think there was this kind of divide in the same way that like maybe is existing now, or like one of the most interesting reviews for me was someone saying it's a film a la Edgar Allan Poe, the Marquis de Sade, and Alfred Hitchcock. And I was like, okay, that's a trio of figures that I can talk a lot about, and I can start thinking about like what's going on in this film, having an interest in power and sexuality and eroticism in my PhD. So immediately I was like, okay, the Hitchcock one, I'm still kind of like maybe 1 or 2 moments, but but yeah, like there's a spirit of it. So I think there's like an intellectual or like kind of literary response, and then there's one that's like, this wasn't really entertaining for me as a Western or something, But I think it was a disappointment because the Hollywood people ended up, screwing him over. His tale is old as time. So it kind of dashed his hopes of like doing something at this level again. But I've heard that it played at like college campuses. I've talked to people who are like, yeah, I saw this in New York in the 60s, or like, these kind of strange ways that people like connected to this film, not only in New Mexico, but like other places. Like, yeah, my wife said that she saw that at, this small college and the East Coast or something. So I think people liked it, but I think it was just so different and new that it's just, the way that new stuff is, it's kind of pushing boundaries. People are like, I don't know if I like it or not,
I think also the language that is used right off the bat in the pre-conversation of like, they're around the fire and they're just like talking about like the Apaches and, like they're gonna kill them and just like all this stuff. I'm like, whoa, like this is right first 5 minutes.
He's kind of putting into words the most brutal version of this kind of perverse white imagination right away, which is kind of like an avant-garde move to like provoke your audience right away with something kind of extreme. I don't know if he was doing that deliberately, but it certainly works today.
Hi, was he hoping, you think, from talking to a filmmaker, was he hoping to have a commercial success from the film, or was he planning to have more of a counterculture or art type of film, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. He definitely wanted it to be as successful as possible, I think. I think he probably knew it wasn't going to be like The Sound of Music or something. But he wanted to be able to make just enough to do another one. So it really was like he saw this as like creating a revolution, that there would be all of these small production companies, local production companies that could be making films in the area outside of Hollywood, doing their own thing, which kind of happened through the film school. Tommy Tomlin, who was one of the first students of Wanzer, is also here today and helped start KRWG TV with Wanzer as a student. And so I think that move into journalism shifted things, and he became a film school professor. And so students were creating art in his classes, and that's a lot of what's in the archives. So in some ways, like, it was not successful in this ideal version that he thought, but there was this resonance of his success doing it in this other kind of way, more academic and more unseen, obviously, and not making any money.
And speaking of the unseen and him not making the mark with the acid Western he wanted to, I believe I have read that you said he scouted much more notable examples of the genre, like hang 'em high, something like that, right?
Yeah, once he finished the film, he was kind of like the local expert for people. There's some 35 millimeters that I found last year in the archives that we didn't know what they were. And it turns out they're called slug. Like, so this is a little bit technical, but when you're screening a 35 millimeter, you have a sound reel and you have to like divide the sound and so they'll use like old film to sort of mark out the time that they need for like the sound to cut in. And it was this film called At the End of the Rainbow, which is also like a campy Something Strange. It's on Something Strange video. It's like a The Wizard of Oz with a young boy instead, but it's filmed out here. And Austin Green, who produced The Devil's Mistress, must have used Wanzer also to scout for his film out here too. There's like a weird story there that I haven't quite figured out yet, but I'm like, why was this film in here in the archives, and kind of connecting the dots, but it's still not clear. Talking it out with Dennis last summer. But yeah, so there's a lot of that where it's like KRWG started, and it's like Wanzer's like the only person in Las Cruces who can like do filmmaking. I think a lot of people were brought in very quickly after KRWG started, but is that kind of, yeah, like that, like he was sort of the film guy. So I've heard I've heard a rumor that he also filmed like behind the scenes of the making of Hang 'em High. I don't know if that's true or not, but I sometimes wonder, like, does Clint Eastwood have those? We need to hunt him down. Like, does he have any, what's the Clint Eastwood archive of, his New Mexico filmmaking? But Teddy's provided me with some cool pictures with Clint Eastwood up in the mountains, and a cool photo.
He did a lot of film work for people that don't know about commercial work. He did a film for Buddy Ritter with the lodge up in Cloudcroft when Buddy Ritter owned it, and he's trying to promote that. And so Orville took a bunch of us and through the snow, and away we went and had a great time. But it was a little different. But you talked about the Hang 'em High documentary. I worked on that and filmed some of that footage.
Beautiful. Yes. Okay.
So,
yeah.
I even have a great picture of Clint Eastwood and of Ed Begley and my favorite Bob Steele, who's an old time Western star, and Alan Hale Jr., the skipper from Gilligan's Island. All those guys were there, and it was a great experience. But he did direct and shoot the footage. And so I worked on that in that summer.
I need you to produce those photos immediately and show them to me.
No, I was just the guy that was available to film it during the summer.
Availability. Oh, yes.
My Achilles heel, you mean? No. I mean, even just like doing this talk today was really helpful in me sort of, it's like that thing of like, you have to kill your darlings. There's so many wormholes in this film. So I think the process of making it is going to maybe force those decisions for me. I know that I feel like there's like a straight documentary, and then there's like a queer documentary. One is like, what is the acid Western? What is the history of film? Like this kind of factual, more straight archive sort of work. And then there's this like meta contextual, biographical and reflective part of it, where it's like I, as a person, am putting together all of these different strands and making sense of them. And I want it to be clear that it's my interpretation. I want to show that I have ethos, but I also don't want to say like, this is the objective story necessarily either. So I want it to kind of have that. That's my grounding, I guess, is like, what is the acid Western, film history in Las Cruces, film history in New Mexico, Wanzer's film. But then there's this like other part of the documentary. I think that's where I'm not really sure what goes in quite yet. And I think that piece I showed was like me kind of thinking through that, because I know the letters have something to do with it. I know his second film, his abstract experimental stuff, and then the student films. Like I want all of that in there, but I'm just kind of figuring out how that's going to piece together. So I appreciate your question, and I'm planning to spend like the next 3 months just finding that edit and making an edit. And does anyone want to be my disciplinarian? I need one.
I will. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you
But-
all so
yes.
much for coming. I appreciate you so much. Thank
Check out the film, y'all. Again, it's live or streaming for free. And again, view it kind of the way that Julie is viewing it, because the other way, it's really hard to digest. But yeah, so
It is like an indictment
Yeah.
versus like a celebration of perverse white masculinity. I think it is trying to call attention to that pathology that's like
Yes.
emerging at this time. But it is hard to watch.
yes.
It's rough. Yeah, it's rough.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. Thank you
So
so
much,
much for being
Dave.
here, y'all. We'll see
Thank
you
you all
again.
so much. I appreciate you so
Yes.
much. Thank you for coming. It means so much to me. Oh, I also wanted to shout out to Saul, who I did an amazing interview with and is going to be featured as well in the documentary. He's talking to like locals about the film. Thank you for coming as well, Saul.